history students. This is Mr. Everton. This is the third time I've recorded this entire video, hopefully the last time. As you can see from the screen and from the title of your notes, we're talking about Asian empires today, which for our purposes, we're really talking about East Asian empires. We're talking about China and Japan, which I have circled on the map here. China in this time period is called the Ming Dynasty. Japan is called the Tokugawa Shogunate, which we'll talk about more in a moment. We're going to start with China, and then we're going to get to Japan. And we're talking about the same ideas that we've been talking about throughout the unit, right? Like, the subject of the unit really is how does a government control people? And so we're going to talk about how China does it. Spoiler, it's the same as what we've been talking about. So one thing in China is called the Mandate of Heaven. Mandate of Heaven is like, the belief that like spirits or gods or something in heaven, so inexact, but like that heaven, like that, there's a supernatural being in heaven who gives their approval to the emperor of China. And that's the reason why the Chinese emperor has authority, right? So religious beliefs giving the emperor authority, very similar to what we've talked about with how like the Ottomans gained authority through Islam and how, African kingdoms became Muslim in order to solidify trade. Like, so belief systems create legitimacy. Okay, so the Mandate of Heaven, the way it works. The gods approve of the emperor. As long as the emperor does a good job ruling, then they keep the Mandate of Heaven. But if they do a bad job ruling, if they become corrupt, if they tax people too much, if they don't protect the people, if they, are harsh with the peasants, then they will lose the Mandate of Heaven. And the way that people will know they've lost it is bad things will start to happen to China, right? Like there'll be floods or earthquakes or some other natural disaster. There'll be an invasion. Somebody will come and attack them. There'll be like a rise in crime. And people will look around and they'll see all that bad stuff and they'll be like, oh, the dynasty has lost the Mandate of Heaven. And then they'll get overthrown and a new dynasty will come and claim the Mandate of Heaven, and then they will start a new government. So the Ming Dynasty has the Mandate of Heaven. They're controlling China. And as long as they're doing what they're supposed to do, everybody will be like, yeah, the Ming Dynasty, they got the Mandate of Heaven. Dynasty just means like the ruling family, right? So the emperor has a kid, their kid grows up to be the new emperor. So that's the dynasty. Okay, another way that the Ming Dynasty controls China is through a philosophy called Confucianism. It was founded 500 BCE, so 2,500 years ago, by a Chinese philosopher named Confucius. This is a painting of what Confucius might have looked like. Confucius taught a lot of stuff, but we're going to boil it down to a simple version for you. He taught that society runs a lot better when people treat each other with respect and when people learn proper behavior. Sounds like somebody's parent. And you know what? Kind of makes sense, because Confucius said that everything in society ought to be modeled after the relationship between a parent and a child. A child should respect their elders and do what their parents say no matter what. And a parent should not abuse that authority and power. They should treat the child with respect and help it to become the best person that it can be. So the emperor of the emperor of China should treat the people with respect and do things in their best interest. And all the people of China have to do what the emperor says. This also gets applied to brothers and sisters. Like a younger sibling has to do what the older sibling says. There's sexism involved because it also is applied to marriages where a woman is supposed to do what her husband says, but the husband is supposed to treat her with respect. So, super sexist. This is Confucianism. And the way that it helped the Ming Dynasty was because it was the center of what they called the civil service system. If you wanted to work in the government for the Ming Dynasty, you would go to school and you would study Confucian texts. Like there's all these books that Confucius wrote, and you would have to study them and learn them. And then eventually you would take a really big, hard exam called the civil service exam. And if you passed it, then you would become a government bureaucrat, like this elite scholarly official. And with that came a lot of money and status. Like you were a big deal if you were a bureaucrat. You would wear special robes, and people would put you on a palanquin, which is like a throne, and then they carry you around. So it was You really wanted that. And so the point is, the people who worked in the government were really smart. Like they had to pass this really hard test. They were good at their jobs. This is a way that the Ming Dynasty made sure that the government ran really smoothly because they had really well trained bureaucrats. Another thing that's very similar is that the Ming Dynasty had monumental architecture. And in this example, we're talking about the Great Wall of China, which is a wall in northern China that was built to keep out invaders from the north. And, the wall actually had been built before this, but the earlier version of the wall was just like dirt. It was like packed up mud and dirt. And this Great Wall, as you can see here, is the one that like the Ming Dynasty spent a lot of money building this like stone brick wall, which not stone brick wall, stone wall, which is like, way more intimidating and impressive. So when you see that, you're like, oh, wow, the Emperor of China. That's a crazy big wall that he built. I respect him now. I know I'm being like a little flip about it, but that's the idea of monumental architecture, right? If somebody can build something impressive, then they have legitimacy. You're more likely to do what they say. Another common theme, controlling trade. China was part of two important trade routes, the Silk Road, which is in red, and the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which is in blue. And China had control over some really valuable luxury goods, silk, porcelain, lacquerware, which is like wood that has been carved and then like painted with like a resin that makes it like shiny but also protects it. And these things were incredibly valuable, and China made a lot of money by having merchants participate in the Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade networks. Okay, briefly, I want to talk about Japan. The government of Japan is called the Tokugawa Shogunate. It shouldn't be plural. It should say, how did the Tokugawa Shogunate control Japan? And so Japan is different. Japan does not have a strong central government like China. China has an emperor with government officials, bureaucrats doing what they say. Japan doesn't have that. Japan has an emperor who's very weak. The emperor of Japan basically only has religious authority, but no real power. Like people are like, think that he is like important spiritually because of the religion of Shinto, but he doesn't really control things. The person who really controls things is a military leader, like a general, called the shogun. And the shogun is the person who actually runs things. The way that he runs things is he gets the daimyo, or the lords, the like nobles of Japan, to like pledge allegiance to him, basically. Like they have to like promise that if he needs them, that they will come and help him, right? And that's all it is. Like it's not so like then those daimyo, they leave, they go back to their like own castles and their own lands that they get to run for themselves. And they're the ones who are in charge of the peasants who are doing all the hard work, like the farming, the agriculture. And the daimyo basically get to like do their own thing. And the shogun can show up and everybody has to do what he says. But then when he leaves, then, like you're on your own, you got your own thing going. So this is called feudalism. It's a very weak form of government where like there's technically somebody in charge, but their power is like not as formal. It's basically like, they're powerful and you tell them that you're going to be on their side and do what they say, but then you kind of get to go do what you want. So that's called feudalism. I want to take a brief moment to talk about isolation. So isolation, like that means you're separating yourself, right? So like if you get home one day and you're in a bad mood and you go in your room and shut the door, you are isolating yourself from the other members of your family. So China, for a long time, was like really active trading in the Indian Ocean. They had this admiral named Zheng He, who was a Muslim actually, and he was the admiral of what they called their treasure fleet, which are these huge ships. You can see one of them pictured here. These huge ships that sailed around the Indian Ocean trading with people and just basically like intimidating everybody by how like massive these ships were. And so Zheng He was doing that, and then the emperor died, and the new emperor who took over was like, you know what? I think this is too expensive. We don't really need to be paying an admiral to like sail around the Indian Ocean. And China decided to burn the treasure fleet, and they isolated themselves and cut off a lot of the trade that they'd been involved with before. So that's an example of China moving in a more isolationist kind of way. Japan went even further. Japan was incredibly isolated. The shogun started to see that Japan was being influenced by outsiders, particularly some Europeans who were showing up, trying to convert people to Christianity. So the shogun declared the seclusion edicts. which were laws that required people to, well, there are a variety of things. One, the only trade that could be done would be one time a year at one port called Nagasaki, which you can see pictured here, and only one European country, the Dutch, could show up and do trade with Japan. And other than that, there would be no trade with Europe at all. And that would keep European things from coming into Japan. Christianity was outlawed. If you practiced Christianity, you would be executed. And you weren't allowed to leave Japan and then come back, right? Like if you left Japan, you needed to stay gone because if you came back, they would kill you. And the reason why is because they didn't want you leaving, going somewhere else, and then bringing back non-Japanese ideas to Japan. They wanted to keep Japan distinctly Japanese and not have any outside influences. And I know that sounds really crazy and probably really harsh, but it actually worked for a really long time. Like the Tokugawa shogunate for a really long time was very successful at making Japan very stable and prosperous. So back to the beginning, you need to write me an aim. You need to write 3 to 4 sentences answering this question. How did China and Japan control their people? Thank you for watching. And yeah, next time we'll be talking about trade routes. I know I'm excited. Yeah.